Age of Prometheus started when mankind mastered fire. And because they mastered fire, they were able to cook their food and were able to take in a greater caloric intake. And the reason for that is because cooking food makes it easier to digest. And because of this, the cost of labor went down because they have more time, since it takes less time. You don't have to sit around all day to digest like chimps. So you're able to have more time, and you have more calories to power a larger brain. So this also made labor more valuable, because obviously if you're smarter, you're more efficient, and you're able to do more complicated tasks. And this eventually led, over a very long period of time, after we accumulated enough tools and know-how, to the Industrial Revolution. Now maybe I should have put in somewhere here the invention of the printing press, because that allowed us to document and share ideas that also helped power the Industrial Revolution, specifically scientific ideas. But anyways, we eventually arrived at industry where human labor was multiplied by the efficiency of machines, and that led to an increase of wealth, relatively large increase of wealth. If you look up the statistics, I believe poverty rates ever since the Industrial Revolution have been on a massive decline. And this eventually led to technology, which is kind of what I'm getting at, is the idea that the start of the Age of Prometheus increased the value of labor by a huge amount. So in tribal times, if you wanted to, say, send a letter to someone, you'd have to get some papyrus or some other, maybe a tablet of clay or something, and write the message in. And you'd have to give it to an envoy or someone who would deliver it for you. And they'd have to run around until they found that person and deliver it to them. So it's this huge ordeal. And if they lived across, across a river or across a lake or on some island in the ocean, you'd have to get on a boat, and then that's the cost of the boat in order to deliver mail. So, but today we send a message through the internet using email, and obviously that's a lot more efficient. So the cost of labor for sending a message is down to 0. And so I want to talk about what that means, because we're approaching a time in history where the cost of human labor will eventually go down to 0, where 0 humans are required to plug in a light bulb, where we're not going to have to depend on human labor for the production of goods. And we're already to a point where some things do not depend on human labor for the production of goods, but they still require humans within that supply chain. So there's still a value for human labor. So technology is one of these things that brings the cost of labor down to 0. And in its place, it places upfront costs of manufacturing. So if you want to make a robot that does manufacturing, you have to pay someone to create the robot. That's an upfront cost. And then eventually you create a robot that creates other robots. I mean, that's sort of the idea. And then there's no upfront cost, or rather the upfront cost is no longer a human expense, but an electricity expense. And so theoretically, if the Age of Prometheus started at the invention, or the mastery, I should say, because it's not invented, but the mastery of fire, then the Age of Prometheus will end at fusion technology when the cost of electricity approaches 0. And this will happen at about the same time that AI is, out of its infantile stages, and at a time when robotics is out of its infantile stages, when additive manufacturing is on the rise, and we're going to hit a point, an inflection point, a point where the whole paradigm shifts, where we're no longer in the domain that humans have been in for the past, 50,000 years. And it's a domain shift. And what that means is it could mean a huge upheaval of norms. Like in the past, if you worked at a factory and they weren't paying you a fair wage, you would just form a union and you'd protest and they'd have to pay you a fair wage because they're losing money while you're not working. But in the future, the cost of human labor will be zero, or rather the cost of labor will be zero. Human labor will not be valuable, and machines will do pretty much everything. And I predict that somewhere around the probably 2040s, because I don't expect fusion technology to be widespread until then, and maybe even the 2050s. So we'll say the loose date of 2045 is when the age of Prometheus will end. And there could be a positive outcome where people suddenly have a lot of free time and wealth and the ability to go places and purchase things that they want, like huge economic freedom and huge amounts of personal freedom and ability to overcome aging and disease. That's the utopian outcome. The dystopian outcome is that people aren't really valuable, and the types of nations that devalue their people and take advantage of the technologies rise above the nations that use their resources to support their people instead of developing the technologies. And so a place like China might move ahead faster than the US because we're more concerned about social programs. So this sort of poses a problem, and that is that inevitably who wins? And my assessment is that probably inevitably the machine wins. And that would be the dystopian future, where people are extremely undervalued because there's always the threat of a more powerful nation that cares less about its people and cares more about its technology, for that sort of a nation to rise to power and to essentially remove other nations and other methods of doing things from relevancy. And that, I guess you would call a post-man society. And that I see as a very dystopian one. So I'm curious as to what other people think, because these are just sort of ideas I put together, and I want to think, I want more thoughts to come into the space. And I want to know what other people are thinking. Is it going to be dystopian future? Is it going to be utopian future? Is it going to be a combination of things? Will the transition period be hard? Will it be really difficult? Will a large portion of the population on Earth die because of it, because of wars, or because the ability to create a nuclear bomb now takes 0 people instead of huge teams? So I'm curious, what outcome do you guys see happening? And that's it for this video. So I'll see you guys next time.